right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Gales. I'm professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies, soon to be Africana Studies at Georgia State University. And it is my honor to welcome you back to the final Freedom School lecture of this evening. And while it would be so rude for me to say that we saved the best for last, I will simply say that we're going to finish strong. It is my privilege to introduce my friend and colleague, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge the hard work of everyone in the Department of Africana Studies, in particular Lakita Burnett Bailey, who pulled together the logistics and worked so tirelessly to make this all happen, starting actually last year. I want to thank Marsh Gardner and everybody at Auburn Avenue Research Library for being such a phenomenal partner for this program and many, many others, including Forrest Evans, Frederick Cox, and the incredible team at Auburn Avenue Research Library. And I want to thank you. And I also want to acknowledge several of our students that are enrolled in our special topics class, Freedom Schools. And I see you, and we look forward to your responses to this lecture. And also see someone named Candace West as one of the participants. You probably know who that is, Dr. West. So let me get started with our introduction this evening. And as I said, it's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Elizabeth West, who is professor of English and interim co-director of the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora at Georgia State University. Her scholarship focuses on spirituality and gender in early to contemporary African diaspora literatures of the Americas. Her current book project, and I believe it's going to be published by University of South Carolina Press, if I'm not mistaken, is entitled Francis, A Narrative of Enslavement, Forced Migration, and the Single Black Mother. This text explores through biography the impact of enslavement and forced migration on Black family and kinship formations in the US South. She is the author of African Spirituality and Black Women's Fiction, that was 2011, and also the co-edited anthology Literary Expressions of African Spirituality in 2013. Her essays and articles can be found in prestigious scholarly and international journals. She is the editor and co-editor of several works. Most recent is the co-edited section, Religion and Spirituality, in the Rutledge Reader of African American Rhetoric in 2018. She co-edits the Rowman and Littlefield Lexington book series, Black Diasporic Worlds, Origins and Evolutions from New World Slaving. She is the recipient of a number of national and international fellowships. She is the former executive director of the South Atlantic Modern Language Association and current treasurer of the College Language Association. She serves on the advisory board of the Obama Institute for Transnational American Studies and is a research member of the University of Mississippi's Asylum Hill Research Consortium. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about that very important work. And beyond all of that, if you've taken more than a few breaths at Georgia State University, you know Dr. Elizabeth West. And beyond all of her accomplishments, she is at the center of so much good work at Georgia State University. And as John Lewis would put it, so much good trouble at Georgia State University. And when I think about my time and my role at Georgia State, when I count my blessings, I count Elizabeth West twice. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Elizabeth West.
Thank you, Dr. Gales. I'm almost speechless after that. I'm not sure how we were going to do this as far as protocol, but my good friend and colleague is going to moderate, Dr. Tanya Washington Hicks, and I guess I'll start and then we'll turn it over to her once I finish. The most challenging task of the evening is ahead of me right now. I'm gonna try to share my screen, and hope that that works out as I plan. And I think we're there. I want to extend greetings and gratitude for those in attendance tonight. In particular, a huge thanks to the Freedom School Director, Dr. Lakita Burnett Bailey, for the invitation, to my intellectual and community family at Auburn Avenue Research Library, to Dr. Jonathan Gales and the Africana Studies Department he chairs at GSU, and a deep gratitude to my colleague, friend, and inspiration in the pursuit of righteousness, Dr. Tanya Washington Hicks, who has graciously agreed to moderate tonight's presentation and discussion. Let's see, give me a second here. I'm having a little trouble with, okay, I'm gonna have to do that. I have to reorganize just a little bit. All right, there we are. In tonight's presentation, Same Archives, Different Stories, Rewriting the Wreckage of White History Making, I began by reminding you that the wreckage of white history making in the US rests in the ongoing misguided myth that continues to be propagated both in and outside academia. That myth is articulated in the regrettable assertion that we can't know the details, the interior experiences, the mind of the enslaved from their perspectives, because we supposedly do not have written records, documents that convey this firsthand. This myth works conveniently with the centuries-old mission to erase Black people's voices and stories from the larger national narrative. But I want us to consider how we can engage these very documents designed to write out Black voices to in fact discover them. As historian Darrell Williams explains, and I quote, "One of the biggest challenges in slave studies is this idea that people were unknowable, that the slave trade destroyed the individuality." He explains further, quote, "The slave trade didn't erase people. We have all kinds of information that's knowable. There are billions of records. It just takes a lot of time to go look at them and to trace the arc of an individual life," end quote. My project is informed in part out of the prism of recent scholarship exploring the commonplace experiences of enslaved people in the antebellum and post-war South. People who, as historian Ibram Kendi tells us, remind us, as he reminds us, are no less important than the reverential figures who survive in public consciousness. History is memory and interpretation of events conveyed through narratives. The matter of history making is a matter of power, where those in power control the representation and interpretation. This is exemplified many times over in contrasting memories that build white or master narratives of history. Think, for example, of the history of Thomas Jefferson that is passed down through the Declaration of Independence. There is no mention of his fathering children by the young enslaved girl Sally Heming, and holding both Heming and children as possessions. Think of Natasha Trethewey's Native Guard, a collection of poems that insists that we remember the Black soldiers who served in and were central to the Union victory in the Civil War. So much silence, so many experiences dismissed or unacknowledged. Through my own research as example, I hope to engage you in reflections and discussion on the necessity of exploring the interior and lived experiences of early African Americans, especially those in the South. This project on the life of the Naksubi Sistrunks will culminate in a 6-chapter life writing project tracing the pre and post emancipation story of my 3rd generation great grandmother, Frances Sistrunk, and her 6 children, following their lives of enslavement and forced migrations into and across Georgia and into Mississippi 4 years before the Civil War. The larger scope of the work converges a personal and a scholarly exploration of the undertold and misrepresented history of Black women's roles, especially so-called single Black women, in the preservation of kinship and family traditions during the slaving and post-emancipation eras. The book will follow the family to 1920, when Hillman, the last of this emancipated generation, dies and is buried more than 130 miles away from home on the grounds of the state's mental asylum. At this site today, Hillman's remains are among the estimated 7,000 buried at what stood as Mississippi's first mental health institute. The institution opened in 1855 as the Mississippi Lunatic Asylum. And in the pre-Civil War Mississippi, and in pre-Civil War Mississippi, was not open to Blacks. By the time of its closure, however, in 1935, the remains of African Americans who died at the asylum would constitute around 80% of those buried there. Despite this unspeakable end, this is a narrative that captures the resilience and perseverance of Black families, in particular, highlighting the ones such as theirs, led by a single Black mother, fresh out of slavery. This story captures the industry, planning, and optimism of Frances and her Naksubi 4, that is, sons John, Hillman, and Shad, and daughter Lucretia, the 4 adult children who established their roots among first-generation freed people in Naksubi County, Mississippi. The denigration of Black single mothers has a long history in this nation. I won't go into a lengthy discussion of that tonight, but in the event that anyone here this evening would benefit from a brief list of examples, the entries in this slide span 4 centuries that demonstrate the persistence of this myth of mendacity and condemnation that continues to be directed at Black women from many sectors of society. And I won't go into details now in the Q&A. If anyone, has questions on this, want to discuss it, I'm happy to come back to it. In a reflection on philosophy called Examine Life, Cornel West calls the Black quest for knowledge and self-examination a reflection of blues music, where the artist is, as he says, riding the dissonance. West argues that African-American art, truth, knowledge arise out of catastrophe and chaos, in contrast to Anglo-centric American artistic and intellectual visions of an orderly world, or one progressing toward order and wholeness. West hints at the challenge I struggled with early in this project that I conveniently call biography. But his emphasis on the way in which the violence and trauma experienced by Blacks in the Americas leaves them building and seeing the world through a different vantage point made clear to me that the conventions of writing a historical account of white experience and interpretation would not serve the writing of this history. In many cases, we have to return to the same documents. but we must read them through different lenses and different codes. To tell the story of Frances and her children, a story triggered in the New World through the catastrophe and chaos of the Middle Passage and the disruption of social and familial systems and traditions through generational enslavement, conventional principles of history, biography, genealogy necessarily have to be revisited. In the throes of this project, it was a rereading of William Wells Brown's 19th century novel, Clotel, and the criticism by contemporary scholars deriding Brown in this novel as model example of plagiarism that ironically led me to sampling as a fitting methodology and theoretical anchor. First published in 1853, Clotel is the fictionalized narrative of Sally Heming and Thomas Jefferson. In an argument that I outline in greater detail and deliberation in the introduction of the forthcoming book, I argued that Brown is appropriating a creative and narrative tradition that takes root in early African-American culture. The appropriateness of sampling rests in its cultural development as theory and act, or theory in action. Sampling offers no overtures to objectivity, no pretense to clinical-like process. It is fueled by intent and does not seek to veil this. My choice to anchor and describe the theory and method of my project as sampling might be likened to Henry Louis Gates's election of signifying over satire to explore African-American oral practice and tradition. Sampling is a dynamic and deliberately subversive act that is grounded in African-American culture and oral tradition. I want a method and theory that reflects African-American resistance through language and language practices. Sampling does this. So just to give you a sense of the many sources and documents that I sample as part of this larger project, I just wanted to, show you this kind of quick list, just to give a sense of, again, the conventional and the unconventional or unorthodox that I've accessed, and that exemplifies the kind of range and diversity of sources that we have to engage if we want to, return to these earlier periods and populations to write the narratives and the experiences of early African Americans. So the starting point for me, if you will, one of the first sampling documents was actually a genealogical sketch passed down, and not just to me, but to my family at large by my aunt, who's now deceased, Dr. Annie Sistrunk, who was the unofficial, I guess no one's ever been appointed, but if one were, she would have been the unofficial griot of the family. And she, on a single sheet of paper, typed out, she never did bother much with the computer as her go-to, so it was in type form, but she sketched out what she knew of the genealogical line. And it was this document then that was my starting document. This document is a document that I actually named, for lack of another term that I could think of. I called it the sources montage. And I want to here acknowledge my undergraduate research student who is part of Georgia State University's HIP program, Sophia Miller, who has worked with me a couple of years on this project and has done a kind of side project of her own. And she did a presentation a year or so ago, and the format, she established a format along this lines, and I was so impressed with it. I told her I was going to have to emulate and use it, and so I have. And this source montage, as I call it, is beneficial because it offers a visual representation of how sampling as a practice might look. So again, it's these numbers of documents, and this again is just a sample, a very small sample of the the large collection of archives that we've looked at and used. But laying it out on a sketch like this, gives you some sense, again, of the concept of sampling, much like people do in music. Um, and at the very kind of backdrop of the image is this map. It's all laid upon a map that also emphasizes that this is a narrative of crossing boundaries, a narrative of migration that takes us on across the Atlantic into the Caribbean and the Americas. So filling in the blanks of Francis's untold story points in part to the genealogical line of a Swiss-German immigrant, Heinrich Sistrunk, who arrived in Charleston, South Carolina in 1746. And before his death in 1760, would introduce slaving into his family line. Francis's story is underscored in sources and archives that extend across South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, connecting to 18th century Swiss Germany and Cuba. Francis was enslaved. If I can just show you, kind of walk you down the path here. She is enslaved by Heinrich's, what would that be, third generation descendant, Jacob Sistrunk Jr. We'll see the connection both through, again, enslavement and as tends to be a regular story in the history of enslavement, you'll see that Jacob also has ties to Francis, the descendants of Francis biologically as well. Okay, and this is just simply a look at the genealogical kind of line that I just showed you, and how this gets reaffirmed and revalidated through other sources. This one happens to be the 79 census report on Gasper Sistrunk, who is the second descendant from the immigrant. And Gasper Sistrunk is the Sistrunk who in fact leads the way out of South Carolina into Georgia for this descendant line. Again, the portals to biographies of Black interiority, self-realization, and resistance can be found in some of the most common of archival documents. I will review a few of the numerous documents I sampled to illustrate how Frances's name and her story emerges. Frances appears on the 1840 census in Marion County, Georgia, as a young girl and lone enslaved person in the household of Jacob Sistrunk Jr. From this point to emancipation, Jacob's financial growth would be determined, for the most part, by the expansion of Frances's family. And just really quickly here, I don't know how well you can see this on the slide, but it's highlighted here in purple. And this is Jacob Sr. on top here, Jacob Jr., and then the other son, Samuel. They live in close proximity. And the second page of this ledger shows the enslaved people recorded in Jacob Sr.'s household, amounting to 10. And this star, this is Frances, the single enslaved person in the household of Jacob Jr. So you might ask, how do I know this is Frances? She's not named. She's unnamed and remains so throughout pre-emancipation census records. No single document will unveil the narrative. Though Frances is unnamed on records that show her in Jacob's household, sampling the conventional documents over times and places, circling back and forth from early to present and adding in unorthodox sources, the story and the names emerge. The 1860 census for Neshoba County shows 48-year-old Jacob owning no land. And I'll try to point to this, if you can see my pointer. This is Jacob on the census. Oops. Listed as farmer, and you'll see that under, this is value of real estate, none for Jacob, but the value of his personal estate is $6,250. That's pretty considerable in today's money. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000. Jacob's ownership claim to Frances and her 5 children would have accounted for the greater percentage then of this estimated financial wealth. But Frances and her children and Jacob's wealth that rested in his lawful ownership of them was unexplored and glossed over in the 1997 publication, The CISTRUNK Families. In their detailed genealogical publication on the Swiss-German patriarch and his descendants, these Sistrunk descendants and authors summarized the oddity of Jacob's wealth as follows, quote, "No slaves were shown, although the value of his personal property was listed as $6,250. The authors also engaged in a similar gloss in their summary of 1850 agricultural records that included accounts of Jacob and his brother Samuel. The Sistrunk brothers report the following, quote, "It seems clear that both Jacob Sistrunk and Samuel were growing corn and sweet potatoes as their major crops. The corn and potatoes were then used to feed to hogs, which were their cash crop, their cash source. They reported no cotton, so they apparently were not in that business." Their conclusion that Jacob and his brother were not in the cotton business suggests that they were then not involved in the business of slavery. However, by 1850, Francis had given birth to 3 children, sons, who along with Francis were recorded on the slave schedule as Jacob's property. And this you can see is what I have pointed to on the slave schedule. That is Jacob CISTRUNK as the owner, if you will, and then 23-year-old Frances and her young sons at that point, 6, 4, and 1 year old. Jacob was clearly in the business of slavery, and as the 1860 census confirms, within a decade, his total wealth would in great part result from his enslaved property, which, as demonstrated on the 1860 slave schedule, shows that he maintained Francis, the older son, and the 2 younger children in his possession, while he leased the middle children, sons Hillman and Shadrach, through the supervision of others. And this can be a little difficult to read. I'm not quite sure how magnified it is for you, but I'll point to it. So here's Jacob. And in his possession, if you will, on the slave schedule, is Francis, and age, shown as age 33, the older son, John, and the 2 younger children, 7 and 5. This is also one of the first moments that we get a description, profile, if you will, for Francis. And actually it's earlier, but I just didn't show that document. But on this document, Francis is shown as female mulatto. Her 2 sons are shown as male and Black, and her young daughter, Lucretia, is shown as female and mulatto. And then really quickly, what we see on this schedule is Jacob leasing the 2 younger sons. And interestingly, they both get listed as the same age. This is Shadrach and Hillman. But this is Jacob in both cases, here and here. And he essentially is leasing them into the care of someone else. In the aftermath of the war, Frances and her 6 children established their roots in Noxubee County, becoming farmers and landowners, advocates for Black voting rights, and 2 sons, Hillman and Shadrach, were actively involved in promoting the education of young Black children in their community. And this is evidence in the county records, the enumeration of educable children. And it's in those records where you see Shadrach and Hillman, in fact, who had no children, but on a number of years in the records, they are not only registering CISTRUNK children, but those of other children as well. Let's see. Here we see just an example of numerous deeds and deeds of trust that I have come across, showing that by 1876, the brothers were landowners and had begun to establish their own households. And this we see in the 1880 census. Here we see Hillman, as head of household, and Shadrach as head of his own household by 1880. They are landowners, of course, by now as well. What we also see here, and this is why I entitled this slide, Autonomy Affirmed, a New Spelling for the Record. This is where you see the CISTRUNKs taking the step of changing the spelling of their name from S to C. And this was done very deliberately to distinguish their family, the Black CISTRUNKs, from the former enslaving white CISTRUNKs who spelled their names with an S. This, of course, is not something I learned from the records, but it is a story that has been passed down for generations in my family. In the aftermath of slavery, the Black CISTRUNKs during that period, to circumvent their mail being delivered to the white CISTRUNKs, took the step of changing the spelling of their name to put an end to that practice. I engaged numerous unorthodox sources to fill in silenced, unknown, or unverified information. Especially helpful was DNA, a rather recent and growing archive in life writing. Through the combined DNA results from 23andMe and African ancestry test, I confirmed Shadrach CISTRUNK's Y haplogroup descent line, which would have come from his father, as originating in West Africa, specifically the Yoruba in present-day Nigeria. A combination of census records that show Jacob CISTRUNK as neighbor to wealthy plantation owner James Dowdell in Harris County, along with slave importation records that show a young enslaved boy named Shadrach among the enslaved brought into Georgia in 1821 by Dowdell, make the case that this was Shadrach CISTRUNK's father. An additional DNA match between present-day CISTRUNK and Dowdell descendants whose lineage point to 1850s Harris County have further confirmed Shadrach CISTRUNK's lineage to Shadrach Dowdell. I did a little sketch here. I realized it just at the very last minute that a sketch might help understand the importance of this. I think perhaps the next slide might make that clearer again, and to emphasize the importance. So what this shows is that, well, the DNA, let me try to pull this together as clearly as I can. It is clear that at least 2 and likely 4 of Francis's children were fathered by Jacob CISTRUNK. Shadrach's, so while that is, remains fairly clear, what is also clear now, though, through the DNA is that Shadrach CISTRUNK was not fathered by Jacob. And this is important if we think about Francis's situation, again, from childhood. She has belonged to, she has been in the possession of this person who has controlled everything about her life. She would not be able to establish a long-term relationship with the enslaved Shadrach Dowdell. but perhaps this relationship and the naming of the son that resulted from that relationship was her declaration of autonomy, if only a brief one. And I can talk about it more in the Q&A if you're, you know, for those who might be interested. But you know, what I go into more detail on in the book is the importance of Frances naming her son Shadrach. It turns out that that naming is key to being able to put the pieces of the past together and connect Shadrach Sistrunk to Shadrach Dowdell, particularly when again you realize that you know the speculation or the likelihood is again that you know probably 4 if not all 5 other children were fathered by Jacob Sistrunk or some other white male person. So before we shift to discussion and answer, I want to share a few slides with you that will add a visual dimension to the narrative that I've offered. This is a photograph of Sophie Sistrunk Marsh, who was the granddaughter of Frances Sistrunk. And Sophie's story is important, and again, I talk about it in greater detail in the book as well. Sophie's story is important. If you know, if there's anybody, I might have a relative or two out here listening today, but for those of us who grew up knowing her as children, her name was always Sophie. But I discovered in looking at her obituary that she used the name Frances, and I found that rather astonishing. But after I thought about it, not so astonishing. In the tradition of naming in African American culture that you know carries over from African populations, you know, we know that a common practice is to name children after the grandparents. So while Sophie's name was Sophie, she went by that name for quite a while in her life. That's how it showed up on the census reports. By the time she had moved to Jackson in 1840, she began to use the name Frances. And, you know, this is arguably Sophie paying homage to her grandmother. Whether this had been part of her name at birth or not, I still can't determine because her full name at birth may have been Sophie Frances, and everybody, of course, just called her by the first name. But it is, again, that way of naming being integral to passing along family history. And so Sophie, who was the person in the Sistrunk family who actually passed down much of the stories and the names that we know, it just, you know, it seems very natural, you know, that in her later years, she would have gone back to her name, the name that connected her to her family, her lineage, and her past. This is Carl Sistrunk, who is the direct descendant of Shadrach Sistrunk, whose lineage that I went through. So he is the son of Noah, who is the son of Shadrach. And that would have been, Shad was again among that generation of Sistrunks, the first freed people in Noxubee County. And this is actually just a fun picture of him, reminding me of the genetic propensity of Sistrunks for fish. And as a bike rider myself, I always find it amusing to see a man on a bike with a basket holding up a fish he just caught. And then the oldest descendant today from the line of Shadrach from Francis is Bunny Sistrunk. And it is from Bunny Sistrunk that I have also been able to gather a good bit of the Sistrunk history. There are two counties in Mississippi, Winston and Noxubee. When Shadrach's descendant Noah left Noxubee, he crossed the county line over into Winston. And this is where his descendants settled at that point. And today there is a Sistrunk Road in Winston County, as you see here, and a Sistrunk Road in Noxubee County as well. I also wanted to come to this point. I'm not sure that I mentioned it on the earlier slide, but in 1895, and actually let me go forward to make this point. In 1895, in the biennial reports of the department and I'll give you the whole title, Biennial Reports of the Departments and Benevolent and Educational Institutions of the State of Mississippi. In this report in 1895, there is an account of visiting the land of a farmer named Hillman Sistrunk. And the report gives the account of visiting and speaking with Hillman to verify what the authorities thought they already knew, and that is that the site of Hillman's land, that on Hillman's land was the site where the 1832 Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek had been signed. So in this 1895 document, and I'll just read a piece of it really quickly, it says, the ground is on the farm of a respectable old Negro named Hillman Sistrunk, who conducted us to the locality described by Mr. Shields, and who also told us that this was the place that he had always heard the old settlers speak of as the treaty ground. So we know that in 1895, Hillman owned that land. This is what is on location at that land now, though. It is now one of the state historical sites and is marked as the site of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. And here are some photos which show what's only remaining now is the foundation of the old church, Brushford Baptist Church, which is one of the earliest churches founded by the freed people of Noxubee in the post-emancipation era. This location, in fact, what I found from the archives was purchased, the deed purchase goes back to they purchased it in 1890. So I suspect that there was a location prior even to this 1890 location. And that is it. Let me see where we are. Yeah, and so I'm going to stop there to make sure we now have some time for questions and discussion.
This was fascinating, Dr. West. I've been copiously taking notes. So I have a lot of questions. I'm assuming that folks will be able to use the chat to ask questions so that I can make sure that we get some input from the audience. But thank you for sharing this personal story and also the journey that this project has taken you on into your own family and your own family history. So my first question is a personal question, but it's a personal story, so I feel comfortable asking it. How did you feel, and I guess how do you feel as you're discovering these documents and you're discovering these experiences that your family has had, and how do you make sense of that, whatever those feelings might be, in your current interactions and relationships with your family that are now the present day realization of all that your family has gone through to this point?
On any given day, it's any mix of feelings, because you look at these records, and once you start lining the records up with the stories that you've been told about your family, the people, their lives, their history, your history starts to line up in a whole new way. You start to understand people who, when you were a kid, you had very different kinds of assessments of, you just, you use rather, succinct language in describing them, mean, that uncle was mean, this one was nice. And you start to think back to that and understand, the anger that people, who loved you had to live with, though. And again, the disappointment and anger that also got to be a legacy in families. I think about these people coming out of enslavement, just having the daring and the tenacity, the creativity to find a way to own land, to farm, to give everything they have to hold that land, but then in the end to lose it. And when you think about the investment in the land as an extension of the self and the worth of the self, what does it mean when you lose your land like that? How do you pick up, and think much of yourself, and even further to try to make sure that you instill in your own children a sense that they are still worthy and that they're still, worth, like there's still worth in living.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So let me ask this question. This is from an attendee. Do you have connections with the European CISTRUNK members, the CISTRUNK members? If so, how have you reconciled this legacy in today's fight for social justice and equity?
It's been really intriguing. I think I was telling somebody today that I have ironically been discovered by more white CISTRUNKs than I have Black via DNA, DNA and ancestry trees. And the conversations have been interesting. I think there are three um, that think of off the top of my head. And I made notes on them, so I'm just kind of going by memory now. But in each case, they contacted me because to summarize, they said something to me like, I've been tracing my ancestry. I see that this person is my ancestor, because at least one of them is direct ancestor of Jacob, who enslaved my family. And the thing it's curiosity, but uh, not curiosity like a question just for the sake of the question. I think they too um, want to try to put pieces together
Mhm.
and understand, because they've been given a sense of history that inoculates them.
Right. And you mentioned that in a book, I think you said it was was it a 1995 publication?
1997. Yeah.
There was a very careful characterization of the wealth, so as not to suggest that any of it was derived from the owning of slaves.
Right, right. Yeah. So and you think about it, when families have maintained that kind of, history, that kind of narrative about themselves, and someone from that family line comes across, a person, such as myself, saying, this is my connection to
Mhm.
this family line, and my story is different.
Mhm.
For some people, they'll run from that because you
Mhm.
don't want to hear what you don't want to hear.
Right.
But then there are people who want to hear,
Mhm.
because they have a desire to try to, to have a more complete picture of, themselves and, in the world of the South.
Right. So we have two questions that I'm going to combine. Whose oral histories are you gathering and using for the book? The examples of Frances naming her child Shadrach and of the Black Sistrunks renaming themselves is powerful. Like I completely agree, Tiffany. This is Tiffany King's question. That naming thing is a theme throughout. The absence of names, and then the reclaiming of names, and then the renaming of people. And a follow-up to that question about what's next in about the oral histories and whose oral histories you're gathering is what is next in your research. Do you plan to append your family history to this lineage? And what is the story that you will tell future descendants about what you've discovered about your ancestors?
Ooh, that's a lot. All right. So on the question of the oral histories, that the story of the naming is of the Sistrunk change from S to C is what I have found most remarkable, because when I meet Sistrunks that I don't know, because out of this work I've come to talk to some C Sistrunks that I didn't know before. But at every turn, that's the story that everybody knows. And
Everyone ancestor told them that story.
yeah. So it's really remarkable to see that story confirmed from, like all corners. And this is what I mean about it's so exciting about, kind of, converging the oral, the unorthodox with the written or the more standard. Because then once I started looking at the official records, things like marriage licenses, census reports, tax records. I mean, you could see on those records the transition of the Sistrunks moving to that C spelling.
Yes.
You know, on the earliest document, you know, where you see the changes, the, you know, it's being spelled SC.
Mhm.
And some of that is because you know, whoever's transcribing documents sometimes just get it wrong.
Mhm.
But some of that, you know, I think is just the Sistrunks playing with the spelling until they finally decide, you know, something like, okay, let's just dump the S and there'll be no questions.
Right. And there's a lot that reflects, you know, it's, you know, as you suggested, it's not just a name change. It is an act of resistance, and it's an act of reclamation of one's identity, and it speaks volumes.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, on the what's next in your research, what do you plan to tell future? What do you want this story to communicate to future descendants?
Yeah, and I guess that's what I actually should have ended with today's talk, because there are several points to this work.
Mhm.
Number one is, when I finish this work, I at least don't want to hear from anybody in my immediate family or world having anything to say in a denigrating fashion about so-called single Black mothers.
Yeah.
You know, go back to the drawing board if you're looking for an excuse for what you think are, you know, things that are wrong, but it is not the single Black woman, because if you return to the history of Black people in this nation, these are the folks who we need to look back on today and say, thank you for holding us,
Mhm. Mhm.
keeping us together. Thank you for remembering and giving us the legacy, you know, you know, has sustained us, and from which we could build, you know. So that's what I see, you know, as center. The other thing too is, I'm interested in this story because I'm also interested in claiming an identity that has been denied Black people since the time they, you know, have been enslaved here. You know, when we talk Southern as if that doesn't include Black people who lived in the South, probably before most people in terms of their ancestral lines, most people who claim themselves as Southern today.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, you know, it's important that we anchor our understanding of our lineage and our past in the South for those of us who are Black and Southern.
Mhm.
And, you know, it has taken a long time for me to think of myself as, you know, particularly Southern. And it's because Southern has been, you know, historically built to mean white. You know, as if Black people here were just kind of always, you know, this accident, uh,
Mhm.
this accidental presence, you know, that they didn't, you know, contribute to the building of this nation, of this space.
Mhm.
And you know, the book is important to me for, you know, to reclaim that space and that narrative.
I mean, it was extraordinary to me that Frances, with 5 children, was able to keep her family intact
Yeah,
um, through, you know, a seismic event in American culture, which is the, you know, the Civil War and the ending of slavery and this very new beginning,
yeah.
and to end up with so many of her children owning land.
Yeah, yeah, and she has actually 6 by the time the Civil War starts, because she has a child at the start of the war, 1860, in Mississippi. Yeah, and of course the story is important too, because it also exemplifies why we also have to, um, you know, we have to rethink and abandon this kind of social death paradigm that we go to talk about the experiences, the culture of African Americans in slavery. Yes, many individuals, were sold on the auction blocks and separated from their families, but there were people, and Francis is the example of it. There were families that were moved and transported as families.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
Families like I looked at Shadrach Dowdell. I followed his line, and he's sold with his wife and family under Dowdell's large ownership. So I'm looking at this man Dowdell, who is passing off his possessions, these slave families, to his children, but he's also passing them off as families. So there was considerable movement of Black families, as well as just, the only thing we ever, get seems to be in public discussion, this idea of people just being so individually here and there and everywhere.
Mhm. Now, I'm glad you mentioned Dowdell, because the other piece of the naming theme was the naming of her son to ensure that there was some recording and documentation of the father, that that this child has been sired with this man and not with the father of her other children. And that, to me, is another act of resistance and reclamation.
Yeah,
Defining.
yeah, absolutely. And I see these things as not just of this world, but almost otherworldly. It's like, it's like these women knew, or they wanted the stories to live,
Mhm.
and they found ways to make those stories live, and naming is important for that. And then if you know how naming practices work, you can then even, generations later, draw certain reliable kinds of conclusions about, the names that people carry.
Mhm. Mhm. I had a question for you, Dr. West, about the racial designations, because on some of the documents, Frances and her daughter were designated mulatto, while the sons were designated Black. But then when you showed the next document, everybody was Black. And then the documents that included the names later on, all of them were also designated Black. Was that a change in the characterization or the definitions of race?
I think that's some of it, and it varies by period.
Mhm.
I think it's much more problematic, for instance, when you see them on the 1860 slave schedule. I think it grounds your authority of ownership, um, to make sure that men, Black men, get declared as Black.
Mm.
Because see, if you think about it, for a Black man in antebellum America, to be designated as mulatto, he's still technically and legally Black.
Mhm.
But what that term suggests is that he has some white ancestry. if he has some white ancestry, there's even though the law has that taken care of, because the child follows the condition of the mother, you don't want to create any kind of avenue in which some Black enslaved person would dare to think that he has a right to an inheritance.
Right.
So if it's a boy, it just makes more sense, to just make sure he's designated as Black, no matter what his phenotype.
Right.
Be.
But with women, they're going to be foreclosed from inheritance rights because of their gender, regardless of their racial designation.
Right. So it's less of a risk.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Interesting. Because I noticed that. So what is, from your perspective, based on your experience, because you are the biographer, but to a certain extent, I'm sure this informs like how you see your family. How has it empowered or inspired you, Dr. West, as you're doing this work? Like, how has it inspired and empowered you as an academician and also as a Black woman in America?
It probably has made me even more difficult to to tolerate, because
say it ain't so.
Yeah, because of what, the one thing that I always was aware of as a child in my family is that there was an immense sense of self-worth that was, that was just propagated. I didn't come from a family where, there was this kind of overriding sense of, meekness or ineptitude. And quite frankly, doing this work makes me better understand.
But you can't help it.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes me, it really makes clear to me why, my family, the elders in my family always expected excellence, always expected that you had the fight in you. And I just, as I look back on these generations, it's clear to me why.
Yes. Well, this was a blessing. I'm inspired. And it's going to reflect, it is going to make me look at my own family, because the things that you discover about yourself that are rooted in these ancestral realities are of value today.
Yeah, and it's necessary. We can't depend on these larger narratives that get written in history books and shoved down our throats and down the throats of our children. And that's no matter who you are, Black, white, Native American, Asian. If you don't tell your story,
yes,
you're in a dangerous predicament, because nobody's interested in telling the story of your heroics. That's just the way
right,
human beings are.
right. The
And
things that would inspire you or motivate you.
yeah, yeah. So it, and it is, to my mind, it is the heroics of the everyday that are phenomenal to me.
Right.
If you're born into this world and somebody's got $1 million for you to start, that's nothing heroic to me. And if you can multiply it, to 10 million, well, you ought to.
Right. That's to be expected.
Yeah, that's to be expected. But when you look at the everyday in this country, to me, that's what is phenomenal. When you look at people and populations of people, who virtually have been stripped of seemingly everything, and you look at what they're able to build, that's phenomenal. Those are the stories to me worth telling. I'm just not interested in a story about a rich man getting richer.
So cliche,
Yes, it is.
so unimaginative. Well, I know we have to close at 8:30. This has been just, inspiring. I'm just all excited. I'm gonna call my mom. I have conversations I want to have with her about my own ancestors. And it just reminds me of the African concept of Sankofa, looking back to move forward and being able to bring the history into the current moment as a way of guiding us through these unprecedented times. So thank you for this project, which is going to, I know it's going to be a blessing to your family, but I think it's going to be a blessing to a lot of other people to discover their own histories. Yeah,
because it's our histories.
Yes, they are. Dr. Gales?
Yes, I am here, and I was chuckling when you told Dr. West that she can't help it. She can't help it. Right. And listen, and thank God for that.
Thank God. Exactly.
Right, because as a result of that, we can't help it either.
Exactly. We can't help it together.
So thank you, Professor Washington, as always, dynamic. Dr. West, that was phenomenal. And I cannot imagine a better way to close the Freedom Schools. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Again, thank you, Auburn Avenue Research Library. We appreciate you so much. And my colleague, Lakita Bennett Bailey, and all of her hard work. Everyone be safe, and we'll see you next time around.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.